May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be aligned with you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. It must have been low tide that morning on the Sea of Galilee, or perhaps the storm had been tormenting the disciples' boat for hours, making the disciples delirious and delusional, so that they merely thought Jesus was walking on water. Or perhaps this sea, actually a large lake, not filled with salt water, froze in certain parts, and Jesus was walking on ice. How else could it have happened? Just before this, Jesus was in a place of grief. He had learned that King Herod served his cousin, John the Baptist's head on a platter at a dinner party. And so he withdraws with his disciples, but a crowd follows him, and he has compassion on this crowd. And so he compels the disciples to feed them. After that, Jesus finally has some alone time and retreats to the mountains to pray alone. He pushes the disciples' boat off into the water just before that, so he can ensure his aloneness. And the Sea of Galilee is placed around mountains such that when an east wind comes, it can create a violent and tumultuous storm. And the winds whipped this boat with the disciples on it miles away from shore. And 3 hours after midnight, the text says, the disciples thought they saw a ghost, which in their realm was more likely than seeing Jesus walking on water. But there he was. Take courage. It is I. Jesus, coming from the mountains in prayer, invokes the great I am, one of the ways God communicated God's self with Moses as he ascended a mountain. I am that I am. And then these golden words from Jesus, which we can truly apply at any moment in our lives. Do not be afraid. Master, if it is you, tell me to come on the water, Peter said. Come. And Peter walked too on the water toward Jesus. Jesus walking on water is considered a miracle, also told in Mark's and John's Gospels. But do we consider Peter walking on water too for a moment a miracle as well? As he's walking, the winds whip up again and Peter becomes afraid. His fear drops him into the water, away from the miraculous. The etymology of the word miracle points to an origin in its roots, meaning to laugh or to smile. A miracle, to laugh or to smile. We see in chapter 14 of Matthew, Jesus doing this dance between the human and the divine, and inviting others into it, namely his disciples. Jesus begins with his humanness, with his deep feelings of grief and loss over his cousin John, his wanting to be alone, and then his heart broken wide open, a feeling of compassion for the crowd that has followed him. And his compassion, his ability to touch his own human heart, invites the dance of the divine, allowing for the miracle of the feeding to take place. And Jesus does not want to dance alone, so he extends his hand, inviting the disciples to live into their divine spark, to feed the 5,000 people. And they haven't had much time to process their part in this miracle of feeding before Jesus basically pushes their boat off to sea so he can finally be alone. And what happens when Jesus is alone on that mountain? In ancient thought, the peaks of mountains represent the closeness of the heavens. We think of Mount Olympus, where the gods reside. And in the tradition of Moses, Jesus goes into the mountain and communes with God. Jesus finally has a chance to pray, to merge, maybe, to allow his own divine spark to grow and glow on this mountain. And perhaps the winds of the storm encourage Jesus to live into